In the forests, which I now entered, I saw to my great joy traces of carts and reindeer on quite a good track. I knew that I was now on the right road, and actually I proved that I was going right when, among the forests, I came upon another village. Here only the Chukchi live. I bought a cart full of supplies there, and I had quite a lot of trouble to make my purchases. The people did not want to take the money. They only wanted to barter. But I had nothing to barter with. I only had good things that I needed myself. But nevertheless, at last I managed to buy very cheaply everything that I wanted. I knew that I was faced by an extremely long journey to Olekminsk, and that I should come upon no more villages among the forests. And now began my wanderings through endless forests and across crags day after day, week after week. I had now been advancing for 2 months at a stretch without thinking of time, astray and alone in these strange regions, where I often did not know whether I was on the right road. But I knew that I was not losing my direction. I might go out of my way for a few days, or I might not take the shortest road always, but I was going north all right. How did I live? How did I keep myself alive in those forlorn Siberian forests? I usually got up at 2 a.m. and crept into the thickets where the hares were to be found. There I would beat around with my stick a few times, and occasionally I killed as many as 20 to 50 of them in a short while. I put them down in the bottom of the cart and salted them, so as to have supplies laid up in store for the time when I should be passing through leaner regions. I always carried more than one word I don't know, I think it's a typo. A quart, maybe, of salt with me. I used to wrap the salted meat in wet clothes to make it last a long time. If I was wandering through regions where I found no hares, I made pancakes out of maize or rye flour and boiled meat. I also baked little cakes of St. John's bread for myself and for my horse. The horse was very fond of these locust husks. I was never afraid. It is true that sometimes I wondered what would happen. If I were to lose myself, if I were to break my leg or injure myself somehow, if I were to catch a fever and had to stay where I was, I should perish there without help, and nobody would ever discover that somebody had passed that way and gone no further. But day after day I became so part and parcel of the forests, of the lonely life in them, that I felt quite at home everywhere. I was quite at ease and feared no disaster. And when, after days of wandering, I at last reached a well-worn track and could thank my lucky stars for having led me on the right road, I never felt any kind of relief, but looked upon it as a matter of course. For I knew that the end of my journey was nowhere in sight, that I would once more plunge into the dense forests, would once more wander through the deserts, and still there would be no end to my journey. But never in my life have I seen drearier forests than the ones through which I now trudged on my way to Olekminsk. There is something depressing about them, and even I, who had got used to these wanderings, used to sit down there in the evening, mournful and deep in thought. Suddenly, in the regions where I had been straying for so long without meeting a human soul, I at last reached some places where people were digging for gold by a river in the forest. This was just before I came to Olekminsk. In the depths of the forest, I used to go a terrible way round, and often I would turn and discover places where it seemed to me I had already been. Then my good spirits would suddenly droop. Sometimes I might have covered 10 times as much ground in the same time. But what was I to do when I could not find the right road? I saved my flour and only used the St. John's bread for baking pancakes. They tasted like almonds. I was fond of them, but the drawback was that I always got colic after eating them. I became weak, and my good spirits soon slipped away from me. I used to make coffee from the St. John's bread, but that did not agree with me either, and I often would sigh and moan for nights at a time in my cart under the awning, clutching at my stomach with both hands. When I got to the gold-bearing streams, I asked whether I was near Olekminsk. I was told that I was not, that it was a good step further on. This disappointed me, so I took a rest near the gold diggers' camp and watched the people working. I soon discovered that all the laborers were absolute slaves there. Among them were many political prisoners in chains. Most of them were working for Belgian and French companies. In fact, nobody could set up on his own there. The laborers who were not actual prisoners worked at an agreed rate and could not earn more than 1 or at the most 2 rubles. In spite of that, there were very many people over a large area all around, and in fact they swarmed there, just as they do wherever gold glitters. Later on, I saw its terrible power at close quarters in Alaska. These gold-bearing rivers had one advantage for me, because I now no longer lost my way. I was meeting people every day and could keep straight to Olekminsk by the shortest road. At last, the people became fewer, and once more strayed into lonely regions, again wandering for days at a time in the depths of the forest, until, at last, I completely lost my way. Autumn was gradually approaching, and with it gloomy thoughts as to what would happen if I could not get out of this dreadful maze before winter set in. Wolves began to show themselves, and sometimes at a distance. I saw whole flocks of them, but at the end of the summer they were not yet dangerous, and with a little caution the pack would not venture near. How delighted I was, then, when, after a few dreary weeks, I saw in front of me, among the trees, the bright glimmer of far-stretching regions under the open sky. At last I was clear of the forests, but I had rejoiced too soon. They were open tundras covered by millions of tiny hillocks, about 1.5 feet high, and the road led up and down the whole time. The cart clattered on and on. In places the tundra disappeared under the water, but I had to pass through it all the same. Sometimes I was up to my armpits in the water, and pushed the cart backwards on to the hillocks, when the horse could no longer manage it. He kept on the hillocks nearly all the time, while I walked a little behind, on one side, and helped to keep the cart from toppling over into the swamps with all its contents. For a long time I wandered forward across this tundra. The road dragged on endlessly until I again lost my way in the forests. It was near these forests that I came upon the Chukchi and the Chauchi, who showed me the shortest way to Olekminsk. I reached a region interwoven with clear streams. Here and there a lake glistened, and on its shores the natives were catching fish and drying them. So as I went on my way, I kept near to them and picked up what I could from them. They gave me plenty of fish. They were generous people, but their fish was dried so hard that I had to boil it again. But it was also very nasty food. I was not used to it, and it did not agree with me. I was glad when I got out of this region, which in other respects was pleasant enough. All those lakes which I had to ride around, and the streams which I had to cross, sometimes with difficulty, delayed me terribly. On the good soil which extended beyond the lake region, I moved forward more quickly for a few days, until at last I saw a town before me. It was Olekminsk, the township surrounded by wooden hills. Nothing but small wooden huts grouped along the shore of the river Lena, which showed me the direction the whole time. Here it was quite a huge river. In summer, a large number of people travel there on steamers with supplies, partly for the townspeople and partly for the gold diggers, of whom there were lots all around. Thousands of people were working on the gold fields around Olekminsk, but I did not stay there long. I wanted to get on as far as possible before winter came. I now saw that my idea of using a small horse for so long a journey was not exactly a good one, and that I should have bought 2 strong horses to make more rapid progress. But by this time I was so accustomed to this particular way of traveling that I did not want to change it. At Olekminsk, I wanted to report myself to the governor, and a colonel took me to his office. But as it happened, the governor was not at home at the time, so the colonel himself examined my papers, nodded his head, and told me that as far as he was concerned, I was just as good a man as the Tsar's brother, that my passport was in order, and my testimonials were satisfactory. He said that he could see from them how well I had worked at Port Arthur on the warships, and on the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. So smart a man ought to get everything at the cheapest possible rate. And so I left Olekminsk with a cart full of new supplies, which sure enough I bought at incredibly cheap prices. And on the other side of Olekminsk, also I came across many kind-hearted people who added to my supplies without even accepting anything in return. Here and there, too, I noticed political prisoners. On the other side of Olekminsk, I was once more held up by the endless forests. In one place where the forest was unusually dense, I was riding along beside an enormous tree. At that moment, a man jumped out from behind the trunk and came straight for me. I was terribly afraid. My knees gave way, and I thought that my last moment had come. The stranger, who looked like a savage, ran up to me, shouting, "Hello! Hello!" I pulled myself together, raised my rifle to my shoulder as quickly as lightning, took aim at him, and shouted that I would at once put a bullet through him if he moved an inch nearer. At this, the man smiled and waved his hand. He then told me to lower my rifle and said that he would do me no harm, and all he wanted to do was pass the time of day with me. For a moment I stayed there, not knowing what to do. I took a good look at him, and there was something in his face which made me feel that he had a kind heart. So I lowered my rifle and said, "What on earth brought you to this God-forsaken place?" The stranger became talkative. He said that he was a political prisoner who had escaped 12 years earlier. He had settled in that oak tree and had been living there ever since. I asked him where he got his weapons and other necessary implements from. He informed me that he killed game with a stick, or else caught it in traps. He led me to his tree and showed me supplies of meat and other things which he had stored up there. He also had various ropes that he used to bend the tree with. He then led me through the forest and showed me what ingenious traps he had made to catch animals with. There was a bent tree covered by the branches of a larger tree and held only very loosely in its bent position. From the tree hung a noose. When an animal moved under the tree and stumbled over the rope, which was drawn tight close to the ground, the tree was jerked upward, and the animal in the noose was tossed up in the air, caught by the throat. Here, for the first time, I saw what dangers threatened me. Supposing my horse had walked into a trap like that, and I had not been able to free him in time from the noose, I should have stayed there entirely alone, and that might well have been the end of my journey. The man led me back to the tree. Just at that moment, 2 women of the Chauchi tribe were returning from the same place. They were terribly smeared in grease, and never in my life have I seen anything like it. They were worse than the Eskimo women, whom I came across in the north later on. They were 3/4 naked. They only had a sort of girdle of leaves around their bodies, just like in the Garden of Eden. Some children were running around them, quite naked. I felt sad to see this dwelling, which was nothing better than an animal's lair. The man also showed me how they made a fire. They rubbed wood against tree bark among dried grass, and in 3 minutes the bark began to smolder, and sparks flew into the grass, which caught alight. The poor creatures did not even have a knife. They made everything for themselves from stone. The castaway gave me a large piece of bear's meat, and I gave him a box of matches, of which I always kept a big stock among my tinned food. He thanked me heartily and showed me the easiest way to reach the steppe of Urda that I had to pass through to get to Yakutsk. I parted from this hermit and again plunged into the forests. About a fortnight after that, I stood in front of the steppe of Urda. It is an extensive steppe, covered with grass and sand, with high hills rising here and there. There are plenty of animals wandering about on the plain. I saw bears, beavers, wolves, foxes, and some cajous, which are a little bit bigger than foxes and rather like wolves. But most of the animals were making their way to the forests, so they did not bother me. That year the summer was long. In fact, by now, though it was already autumn, the weather was still warm. There was no lack of water there. As far as I remember, it took me 47 days to get across that steppe, and its calm, broad plains dotted here and there with Mongolian villages. For 4 days I rode through that beautiful plain, which suddenly was replaced by the taiga. Here the country was swampy. I had to be extremely careful and ride only where the road was clearly marked and bore traces of wheel ruts.